Mississippi, 1851. They called him Caleb the Ghost, not because he was dead, but because his pale white skin made him look like a spirit walking among the living. Born albino to enslaved parents on Ashford cotton plantation, Caleb had spent 25 years being treated as a freak show by his master, Colonel Ashford. But on one scorching July morning, something snapped inside the ghost, and what happened next in that cotton field would be whispered about in terror for generations. Picture this. You're a plantation owner who spent years displaying your albino slave like a circus animal, charging neighbors to come see the white Negro who picks your cotton. You've made him work twice as hard as other slaves just to prove he's still property despite his skin color. You've humiliated him, beaten him, and turned him into entertainment for your twisted guests. Now imagine waking up to find that same slave standing over you in your bedroom at 3 a.m., his ghostly white face glowing in the moonlight, holding a cotton hook dripping with blood. Not just any blood, your blood. Because Caleb the Ghost has spent the entire night systematically draining you dry, one cut at a time, in the same cotton field where you'd forced him to perform for audiences. This is the story of how the most humiliated slave in Mississippi became its most terrifying ghost story. A man so broken by exploitation that he decided to break his master in the most methodical way imaginable, by bleeding him white in the place where white supremacy lived and breathed. But this isn't just about revenge. This is about what happens when you push a human being so far beyond their breaking point that they discover they're capable of horrors that would make the devil himself proud. Caleb didn't just kill Colonel Ashford. He created art with his death, turning murder into a masterpiece of psychological warfare that terrified every plantation owner in the Deep South. So let me ask you something that will chill your soul. What would you do if someone had spent 25 years treating you like a zoo animal? Would you break them quickly and mercifully? Or would you take your time, savoring every moment as you slowly drained the life from their veins, while they begged for mercy that would never come? Because Caleb the Ghost chose the slow way. And what he did to Colonel Ashford in that moonlit cotton field will haunt your nightmares forever. Let me take you back to the beginning, back to when Caleb was just a curiosity instead of Mississippi's most feared killer. Born in 1826 to field slaves Sarah and Moses, Caleb's albinism made him an immediate sensation on Ashford Plantation. While other slave children were just property, Caleb was a novelty, a genetic accident that Colonel Ashford quickly realized could be profitable in ways beyond simple labor. From age 5, little Caleb was dragged out whenever plantation owners visited, forced to stand still while grown men poked and prodded him like a museum exhibit. "Look at this," Colonel Ashford would say, grabbing Caleb's hair to show how it was white as cotton. Born to Negro parents, but white as any of us. Ain't that something? The visitors would laugh, make jokes about God's sense of humor, and sometimes even place bets on whether Caleb was really the child of his supposed parents. Through it all, Caleb would stand there silent, his pale pink eyes staring at nothing, learning to disappear inside his own mind while his body was treated like property. But the real horror began when Caleb turned 12 and Colonel Ashford discovered that people would pay money to see the white Negro perform field work. Suddenly, Caleb wasn't just an occasional curiosity. He was a full-time attraction. Every weekend, carriages would arrive from neighboring plantations, filled with wealthy whites who had heard about Ashford's albino slave and wanted to see him for themselves. They would gather around the cotton fields, sipping mint juleps and fanning themselves, while Caleb was forced to pick cotton under the scorching Mississippi sun. His albinism made his skin incredibly sensitive to sunlight, causing him to burn and blister within minutes of exposure. But that only added to the spectacle for the watching crowds. "Look how red he gets," they would exclaim, pointing at his sunburned skin. "Just like a regular white man, but he's still a slave." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here was a man who looked white being forced to work alongside darker-skinned slaves, his appearance making his bondage seem even more unnatural and entertaining to the white audiences. Colonel Ashford charged 50 cents per person to watch Caleb work, making more money from exhibiting him than from his actual labor. But money wasn't the only motivation. Ashford was a man who genuinely enjoyed the psychological torture he was inflicting on this genetic anomaly who challenged the very foundations of racial hierarchy. You see, Caleb's existence was deeply disturbing to the white supremacist worldview that justified slavery. How could you claim that black skin marked someone as naturally inferior, when here was a man with white skin who was still enslaved? The answer was to make Caleb's enslavement even more visible. Even more humiliating, to prove that blood mattered more than appearance. And Caleb felt every moment of that humiliation burning into his soul like acid. For 13 years, from age 12 to 25, he endured twice weekly exhibitions where wealthy whites would come to gawk at him, make jokes about his appearance, and discuss his body as if he couldn't hear them. He worked longer hours than other slaves because his performances required him to demonstrate his strength and endurance. He was fed less because Colonel Ashford claimed his pale skin made him look healthier and therefore needed less nutrition. Worst of all, he was completely isolated from the slave community. The other enslaved people didn't know how to relate to someone who looked white but shared their bondage. The white overseers treated him with extra cruelty to prove that his appearance didn't earn him any special consideration. He existed in a racial limbo, belonging nowhere, accepted by no one, useful only as entertainment. But isolation gives a man time to think, and pain gives a man motivation to act on those thoughts. During those long nights alone in his cabin, Caleb began to develop what he would later call his education. He watched and learned how the plantation operated, who held power and when they were vulnerable. He studied the routines of Colonel Ashford and his family, memorizing their schedules and habits. Most importantly, he began to understand that his unique appearance, which had been the source of his suffering, could also be the key to his revenge. The plan that eventually formed in Caleb's mind was as pale and ghostly as his appearance, subtle, patient, and absolutely terrifying once you understood its true scope. He wouldn't just kill Colonel Ashford, he would transform him into a work of art, a masterpiece of revenge that would serve as a warning to every other plantation owner who thought they could treat human beings as entertainment. The transformation began on July 4, 1851, Independence Day, though the irony wasn't intentional. It was simply the day when Colonel Ashford made a crucial mistake that gave Caleb the opportunity he had been waiting for. The plantation was hosting its biggest exhibition yet, a 4th of July celebration where dozens of neighboring plantation families had come to watch Caleb perform while they celebrated American freedom. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife, but none of the white guests seemed to notice as they cheered for liberty while watching a man forced to work under the blazing sun for their amusement. What they couldn't see was that Caleb had spent months preparing for this day. He had stolen a cotton hook, a sharp, curved tool used for harvesting, and hidden it in his cabin. He had studied Colonel Ashford's routine and knew that after big parties, the colonel would often take late night walks through his cotton fields, checking on his crops and enjoying the sight of his domain. Most importantly, Caleb had realized that his ghostly appearance, which had made him a freak show for 25 years, would make him nearly invisible in the moonlight. Against the white cotton plants, his pale skin would blend perfectly, making him a phantom that could move unseen through the very fields where he had been humiliated. The party ended around 10 p.m., with the guests departing in their carriages after a day of entertainment at Caleb's expense. Colonel Ashford, flushed with success and bourbon, retired to his study to count the day's profits from ticket sales. According to Caleb's calculations, the colonel had collected over $30, more money than most slaves would see in their entire lives, all earned from displaying Caleb like a trained animal. At 11:30 p.m., just as Caleb had predicted, Colonel Ashford emerged from the house for his traditional post-party walk through the cotton fields. He was alone, slightly drunk, and completely confident in his safety on his own property. After all, what slave would dare to threaten him? They all knew the consequences of violence against a white man, especially their master. But Caleb the Ghost wasn't thinking like a slave anymore. For the first time in his life, he was thinking like a predator. Moving through the cotton rows like a pale wraith, Caleb followed Colonel Ashford at a distance, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His years of forced performances in these fields had taught him every pathway, every hiding spot, every place where the moonlight cast shadows and where it illuminated the ground like daylight. The attack, when it came, was swift and silent. Colonel Ashford never saw his ghostly assailant until it was too late. One moment he was walking peacefully through his cotton empire. The next he was on the ground with a cotton hook pressed against his throat, staring up into the pale pink eyes of the man he had tortured for 13 years. "Master," Caleb whispered, his voice soft as cotton fiber floating on the wind. "Time for your final performance." What happened next in that cotton field would become the stuff of nightmares throughout the Mississippi Delta. Caleb didn't kill Colonel Ashford quickly. Instead, he began what he called his Ort Project, a systematic process of bleeding his master white in the same place where Caleb had been forced to work for the entertainment of others. Using the cotton hook with surgical precision, Caleb began making small, careful cuts along Colonel Ashford's arms and legs. Not deep enough to cause immediate death, but strategic enough to ensure a slow, steady loss of blood. Each cut was placed exactly where it would cause maximum pain, while allowing Caleb to control the rate of bleeding. "You made me perform for 13 years, Caleb said quietly as he worked. "Now it's your turn. Perform for me, master. Show me how a white man bleeds." Colonel Ashford's screams echoed across the cotton field, but the nearest neighbor was miles away, and the sound was muffled by the dense rows of plants that had witnessed so many of Caleb's forced performances. For the first time in his life, Theodore Ashford was completely helpless, completely at the mercy of someone he had considered less than human. But Caleb was just getting started. As Colonel Ashford's blood seeped into the Mississippi soil, Caleb began to arrange his master's body in a grotesque parody of the poses he had been forced to assume during his exhibitions. Arms spread wide like he was showing off his muscles, legs positioned as if he was demonstrating his ability to work, head tilted back as if he was proudly displaying his features to an audience. "Look at you now," Caleb whispered. "The great Colonel Ashford, putting on a show. How does it feel to be the entertainment?" The psychological torture was as methodical as the physical bleeding. For every humiliation Caleb had endured, he inflicted a corresponding wound on his master. For every joke made at his expense, he drew another line of blood. For every dollar Colonel Ashford had earned from displaying him, he took another ounce of life. The process lasted 6 hours, 6 hours of careful, artistic bleeding that transformed Colonel Ashford from a proud plantation owner into a pale, broken thing that barely resembled the man who had tortured Caleb for 25 years. By dawn, the Colonel's skin was as white as Caleb's had always been, drained of blood and life in the very cotton field where he had forced his albino slave to perform for audiences. But even in death, Colonel Ashford wasn't finished performing. Caleb arranged the body in the center of the cotton field, surrounded by bloody cotton bowls that he had dipped in his master's blood. The scene was visible from the plantation house, ensuring that whoever discovered it would receive the full impact of Caleb's artistic statement. Then, like the ghost he had always been called, Caleb simply vanished. When the overseer found Colonel Ashford's body the next morning, the scene was so horrific that he vomited before he could even approach the corpse. The methodical nature of the wounds, the artistic arrangement of the body, the bloody cotton scattered around like some kind of ritualistic offering, it all suggested a level of calculated hatred that no one had imagined any slave could possess. But the most terrifying aspect wasn't the murder itself. It was the complete absence of the killer. Caleb the ghost had disappeared as suddenly and mysteriously as he had struck, leaving behind only questions and a level of fear that spread through the white community like wildfire. The manhunt that followed was the largest in Mississippi history up to that point. Hundreds of men with bloodhounds scoured the countryside, searching for any trace of the albino slave who had committed such a horrific crime. Rewards were offered, threats were made. Innocent slaves were tortured for information they didn't have. But Caleb had become what he had always been called, a ghost. Some claimed to see him moving through cotton fields at night, his pale skin glowing in the moonlight like a vengeful spirit. Others reported finding bloody cotton bowls arranged in disturbing patterns, suggesting that the ghost was still creating his art with new victims. The truth was both simpler and more terrifying than the legends that grew up around him. Caleb had used his intimate knowledge of the plantation system and his unique appearance to disappear into the network of swamps, abandoned plantations, and forgotten corners of Mississippi where a man who looked white but thought like a slave could survive indefinitely. He became a legend among the enslaved population, proof that even the most oppressed person could find a way to strike back against their oppressors. The story of how he had bled Colonel Ashford white in the cotton field spread through the slave quarters like gospel, whispered in the darkness as evidence that justice, however delayed, would eventually come for those who treated human beings as entertainment. For plantation owners throughout the South, Caleb the ghost represented their worst nightmare, a killer who could pass for white when necessary, but carried all the rage and knowledge of the enslaved. The fact that he had never been caught meant that he could be anywhere, could be anyone, could strike again at any moment. Several plantation owners reported attacks that bore Caleb's signature. Victims found blood white in cotton fields, arranged in poses that mocked the dignity they had denied their slaves. Whether these were actually Caleb's work or copycat killings inspired by his legend was never determined, but the psychological impact was the same. The ghost story became reality when plantation owners began changing their behavior out of fear. Late night walks through cotton fields became a thing of the past. Exhibitions of unusual slaves were quietly discontinued. The casual cruelty that had characterized master-slave relationships became tempered by the knowledge that someone was watching, someone was remembering, someone was planning revenge. Caleb himself was never seen again after that July morning in 1851. Some said he died in the swamps, finally free but unable to survive without the system that had oppressed him. Others claimed he made it north, where his white appearance allowed him to disappear into free society. A few insisted that he was still out there, still hunting plantation owners who thought they could treat human beings as curiosities. The truth died with Caleb, but his legacy lived on in the changed behavior of every plantation owner who had heard his story. The ghost had achieved something no other slave rebellion had managed. He had made the oppressors afraid of their own shadows, literally and figuratively. Colonel Ashford was buried in an unmarked grave, his family too ashamed of his death to create a memorial that would remind people of how he had died. The Ashford plantation was abandoned within 6 months, no one willing to work or live in a place where a slave had turned his master into a work of bloody art. The cotton field where the murder took place was never harvested again. Local slaves claimed that the cotton there grew white as snow, but was stained with blood that could never be washed out. Whether this was true or simply another part of the growing legend, no one was willing to test by actually entering the field. Today, the site of Ashford Plantation is marked only by overgrown foundations and a historical marker that makes no mention of Caleb the Ghost or his artistic revenge. The official history treats Colonel Ashford's death as an unsolved murder, one of many violent incidents in the turbulent antebellum period. But in the folklore of Mississippi's African-American community, Caleb the Ghost lives on as a reminder that no oppression is so complete that it cannot be overcome by sufficient determination and creativity. The albino slave who was displayed like a circus freak proved that even the most humiliated victim could find a way to turn their tormentor's cruelty into their own weapon. His story serves as a testament to the power of patience and planning, showing that revenge, like fine art, is best created slowly and carefully. The man who was treated as entertainment for 25 years ultimately created the most terrifying performance in Mississippi history, one that continues to haunt the collective memory of the Deep South. Most importantly, Caleb's revenge illustrates how systems of oppression often contain the seeds of their own destruction. By making him a spectacle, Colonel Ashford had inadvertently given Caleb the skills he needed to become invisible. By isolating him from both white and black communities, he had created a killer who belonged nowhere and therefore could strike from anywhere. The ghost's final performance in that cotton field wasn't just murder, it was a masterpiece of psychological warfare that transformed one man's humiliation into an entire region's nightmare. In bleeding his master white, Caleb had drained the color from the myth of white invincibility, replacing it with a fear that would never fully heal. The pale specter who haunted Mississippi's cotton fields proved that sometimes the most artistic revenge comes from those who have been treated as less than human. And sometimes, becoming a ghost is the only way to finally become free.